The number of poor people in the world in 2022, before the COVID-19 pandemic and the current cost of living crisis, was around 1.2 billion people globally, spread across 195 countries, living in acute multi-dimensional poverty. The global poverty line was updated in September 22 from $1.90 to $2.15 per person per day. With just over 1 in 8 people in poverty, with most fearful of the unpredictability of their futures, their inability to effectively address the challenges they face on a daily basis, helpless to voice their concerns, be counted and included in the democratic decision-making process, has also seen examples of those who have successfully emerged to live full and effective lives. But realizing the enormity of poverty at the global level, I understand any success made to alleviate poverty to be the exception rather than the norm, with exceptions frantically waved as one would a white flag to attract attention and applause. Recent learnings gained from the events of COVID-19 and Russia's war on Ukraine and the rest of the world have made it very clear the fact that those in control of resources can and do manipulate their availability and profit from creating scarcity. Although we've seen it happening all over the world in what we term hotspots, those events haven't really affected us as much as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, with the scarcity of food grains and gas, impact on the movement of goods across nations, and the reallocation of country budgets from development to defense and other portfolios. The beneficiaries of conflict are those with the resilience and wealth to change as the situation resolves to find its place in the natural order. As seen in past events, the instability created by a continuing fear of the world having to face conflict and new pandemics unprepared, an unstable and declining global economy allows the resilient wealthy, who comprise many fewer than 20% of the world's population, to stockpile essentials and fortify themselves against the worst imaginable nightmare, while almost 8 billion people remain insecure, being at varying levels of resource vulnerability, who believe themselves succumbing to starvation, disease, and death.
Sudan is a country located in northern Africa bordering the Red Sea. Neighboring countries include Central Africa Republic, Chad, Egypt, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Libya, and South Sudan. Khartoum is the capital of Sudan. The current population of Sudan is more than 46 million as of December 2022 based on UN data. Major language is Arabic. Sudanese pound is the currency. The geography of Sudan is generally flat with mountains in the east and the west, and annual flooding in the south due to the Nile River system. The government system is a federal republic. The chief of the state and head of government is the president. Sudan has a largely traditional economy in which the majority of citizens rely on agriculture, and there is limited central planning by the government. Sudan is a member of the League of Arab States and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA. Sudan grows a variety of crops that include cereals like wheat, sorghum, millet, and corn, in addition to oil seeds like sesame, groundnuts, and sunflowers. Also, Sudan grows beans, chickpeas, and lentils, and others include cotton and fodder crops. Although Sudan has 48 million hectare arable land, only 21% cultivated. Industries in Sudan are like sugar, cement, consumer goods, exports. Most of Sudan exports um, are gold, which represent 70% of total exports, followed by livestock, which represents 25%. Others include oil, Arabic gum, and cotton. Sudan imports the raw sugar, wheat, cars, packed medications, and tractors. The population below the poverty line was estimated in UN reports indicating in April that 46.5% of the country population lives below the poverty line.
Okay,
Okay.
I'm here today with Don McPhee. In Sudan, I'm MACABBEY in California, USA. This is my first interview with somebody in the poverty agenda, where we're going to be discussing themes of poverty around food security and other issues. And as this first one, I'll just give you my brief background as I've worked since the late 70s, so over 40 years in the area of international development, humanitarian aid. And I have the privilege of introducing Don McPhee, whom I knew from our almost mutual days in Sudan in the early 80s. But let me pass it over to you, Don, to get your introduction.
Okay. Thanks, Mac. Nice to be here with you. Maybe a bit about myself. I'm from the west coast of Canada. I've been a world traveler for a number of years, and I've worked overseas for more than 40 years. I'm Canadian, but I haven't lived there for more than 40 years. I've run organic farms. I've worked in all the continents, and I worked in various positions, particularly in international NGOs. And that has included at community and field level, and also in headquarters and regional.
The poverty agenda is trying to get a dialogue going amongst several of us that have worked overseas, or especially you that are still working. In this case, Sudan, Khartoum, Sudan, around your thinking on what are the root causes of poverty and what's being done on the world stage, let's say, to address them, if anything.
So the lesson for me is that a root cause of poverty, in all honesty, is an inequity in the distribution of income. See very recently where we see a decline in the disposable income of people, with a greater concentration of wealth in many countries of the world. That makes it much, much more difficult, almost impossible to address poverty. So, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Don, that your observation I really appreciate. I think my experience in Bangladesh and then knowing a little about India too, I would say there was something somewhat similar in terms of the massive poverty from the 70s and the 80s, and then slow progress that has allowed people to have agency and increase their not only income but their own empowerment. We use that term to address their own needs. But I'd like you to reflect on exactly what you were just talking about, this theme, how a place like, well, take Sudan very specifically, because I know you were there since the early 80s. You're there today. What hasn't happened there?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. And I'm sorry to say that poverty has not been alleviated in Sudan. Because
is there any trend?
What has happened here, there's not even a trend. The trend is a greater concentration of wealth, as there is in other places. And there's been and all of the wealth is in private hands or in the hands of corporates, including military corporates. And so the reality is the government or no one is in a position to increase the disposable income of a significant portion of the population. So from the time you and I have been here, Mac, we've seen incredible wealth in the country, from oil, from gold, from gum arabic, from sesame, from other natural resources. But that has not translated into any poverty alleviation, except, and maybe this goes to another important lesson I see from Sudan, is another way, an important way other than distribution of redistribution of income, making sure people have disposable income for basic needs and their development, is education. And I think one of the biggest ways to alleviate poverty is through education. And yet, I see in Sudan, as I've seen in other countries, that education has been privatized and much more monetized in recent years. And so we less and less, and coming back to Sudan, I feel when I've been here in the 80s and then in the 2007, 2012, I had seen in the 80s education as a great catalyst for poverty alleviation. Through education, people were able, I've seen, a single mother, I have a wonderful memory of a single mother doing everything to educate her daughter, who became a teacher, and thereby made a significant change in the poverty level. The family, the mother and her children, because of the education of the daughter and others, they really made significant move out of poverty. So education can play a big role. But I've also seen in Sudan and other places, with the privatization and monetization of education now becomes less of a way for poor people, for those very poor and marginalized, to escape poverty, because the education is now privatized and they have either no access to it, or the access to the public education is so much poorer than to public education, it no longer has the same value for escaping poverty. Back, I look at the whole thing and I say, we as people, particularly those who focused on community development, we've made significant changes in the lives of some children, of some families, and some people. We've achieved that and we've succeeded. And particularly because the solutions were rooted in those communities, in those local areas. What we haven't done as a global community is be able to translate small-scale local community development into larger scale poverty alleviation, unless, like in China, it was imposed by a very powerful central government.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna cut off the recorder, but you can stick around just a sec.
Yeah.
Hunger, Politics and Society. The Poverty Agenda aims to investigate global food availability by reviewing the production and availability of food resources essential to our well-being, to understand how this resource is managed, the politics that determines who benefits and by how much, and how legislation aims to ensure food access to all.
Hunger Politics Society. Sudan population below the minimum level of dietary energy consumption, also referred to as prevalence of undernourishment, shows the percentage of the population whose food intake is insufficient to meet dietary energy requirements continuously. 12.3% of the population in Sudan was in hunger in 2019. Food insecurity. The combined effects of conflict, economic crisis and poor harvest are acute hunger in Sudan to more than 18 million people by September 2022, warns the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization (FAO) and the World Food Programme WFP. In the 2022 Global Hunger Index states Sudan ranks 106 out of 121 countries with a score of 28.8. So Sudan has a level of hunger that is serious, as hunger causes cognitive problems for children, health problems for adults such as diabetes, hypertension, poor sleep, and overall poor health. The depreciation of Sudanese pound is in addition to rising food and transportation costs are make it harder for families to put food on table. A lack of access to hard currencies is likely to result in the SDG further depreciation.
Food production and distribution on peace and security. The Poverty Agenda reviews how food produced is globally distributed, the impact of trade regulations and other factors on the cost of foods, and the extent to which steps to address the effects of climate change continue to be our best options.
Food production and distribution on peace and security. Achieving food security is essential to build sustainable peace, and without peace, the likelihood of ending global hunger is minimal. The two-way links between conflict and increased food insecurity, and between peace and sustainable food security, are unique to each case and often complex. Based on a review of recent research, food insecurity itself is a cause of conflict. Food insecurity, especially when caused by higher food prices, hastens the risk of democratic breakdown. Civil conflict, protest, and communal conflict. As of UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, incidents of localized conflict between communities, mainly over access to and control of resources, contributed to displace and affect civilians, with 32,777 people displaced in November in parts of West Kordofan and Central Darfur states. Since the beginning of 2022, about 298,000 people were displaced due to conflict. 896 people were reported killed and another 1,092 injured because of conflict and violence. The majority of the displaced are in Blue Nile and West Darfur and West Kordofan. Overall, 334 security incidents due to localized conflict and armed attacks have been reported across the country in 2022, including 45 incidents in November. From January up to September 2022, the UN and humanitarian partners provide 9.1 million of the most vulnerable people in Sudan with some form of humanitarian assistance, including food, access to health, water, sanitation, protection, and other services. Meanwhile, the number of dengue fever and malaria cases are on the rise, with more malaria cases reported during the first 11 months of 2022 than the entire 2020.
Creating a food secure society. The Poverty Agenda discusses the impact of hunger on global and regional peace and stability and how this affects us. A recent statistic states that globally, almost 1 in 10 people don't have enough food to eat.
Creating a food secure society in Sudan. WFP stated two-thirds of the population live in rural areas, with the economy heavily dependent on agriculture. However, the sector is vulnerable to climate shocks and productivity is low due to inadequate farming practices and post-harvest losses. Domestic cereal production from the 2021 and 2022 agricultural season is expected to reach 5.1 million metric tons, covering the needs of less than two-thirds of the population. This will leave many people reliant on humanitarian food assistance and dependent on the importance of essential grains at prices beyond the reach of the people.
The poverty agenda continues to identify and suggest practical options that could contribute to ensuring a better level of food security and a healthy lifestyle for families when facing any unforeseen times of shortages.
Tiny enterprises. The household enterprises in Sudan. 1. Agriculture is the main source of income in Sudan, with over 70% of the population involved in farming and livestock herding. 2. Animal husbandry is also an important part of Sudan's economy, with the country having over 10 million heads of animals. 3. Fishing is also important in Sudan, with the Nile, Red Sea and other rivers providing a variety of fish for both subsistence and commercial purposes. 4. Carpentry, pottery, and metalworking are traditional industries in Sudan, with many people in rural areas making furniture, wooden items, clay pots, tools, weapons and other items for sale. 5. Weaving is a common household industry in Sudan, with many families producing traditional textiles for sale. The most profitable household enterprises in Sudan include farming, livestock rearing, small-scale manufacturing, retailing, hospitality services, and food processing. These businesses offer a low-cost entry for entrepreneurs and make use of available resources in the country. They also provide employment opportunities for many people, thus contributing to poverty reduction in the country.
Welcome to the Poverty Agenda channel, where our views are presented and practitioners engaged face-to-face to elicit their informed opinions regarding the goal of a hunger-free world and human rights, the relationship between poverty and wealth, and present local income-generating options to keep us engaged and in profit. Please do like and subscribe to encourage the teams at no extra cost to yourself.